Today on Cyberwork, Sean Falconer of Skyflow and the host of the Partially Redacted and Software Huddle podcasts joins me to talk about the present and future of consumer and user data privacy, the pros and cons of adding more privacy regulations into place, and his journey from software development and engineering to his current place of working closely and deeply with the future of API-based data encryption and privacy. And stick around because Sean's going to share some of the best career advice he's ever received. All that and more today on Cyberwork. Welcome to this week's episode of the Cyberwork with Infosec podcast. Each week we talk with a different industry thought leader about cybersecurity trends, the way those trends affect the work of Infosec professionals while offering tips for breaking in or moving up the ladder in the cybersecurity industry. My guest today, Sean Falconer, has a lofty goal to make the digital economy safer, and he's doing so one API at a time. A former competitive programmer, entrepreneur, and expert storyteller, his many accomplishments, including designing the software used to create ICD-11 at the World Health Organization, founding Proven.com, and leading developer relation teams at Google. When he's not interviewing industry insiders as one of the hosts of the popular Software Engineering Daily podcast, or diving into all things data security and privacy on Partially Redacted, you can find this world-class tech talent serving as head of marketing and developer relations at Skyflow, the world's first and only data privacy vault delivered as an API. So today we are going to be talking about a topic that Sean suggested, and to sort of break it down into a single phrase, he was suggesting that we might be getting close to the quote wild end of the Wild West era of data collection and data privacy. So we're going to see if that's true, and we're going to see what's on the horizon, and I look forward to hearing about all of it. So Sean, thank you for joining me today, and welcome to Cyberwork.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
My pleasure. So to help our listeners get to know you, maybe some of them are already listening to Partially Redacted Software Engineering Daily, but for those who don't, when did you first get interested in cybersecurity and tech? What was the initial draw, and how far back were you when you realized you were excited about it? Do you remember how you got started learning and everything?
Yeah, I mean, tech, I would say, started when I was, very young, sort of early high school. It was kind of I was fortunate, or I at least consider myself fortunate to kind of had been in high school in the 90s when sort of the internet was being introduced to the home. Mm-hmm. And that really, I grew up in a small place in Canada. So that kind of, the idea of like unlocking the world where I could suddenly talk to different people or, connect online, learn anything I wanted was absolutely amazing. And I just dove in full force. And in terms of security, I would say that I kind of dabbled a little bit at different parts of my career. Mm-hmm. So initially, when I was doing my master's degree, I worked for a company called Bulletproof Solutions as a software engineer, which was a security company. And we were actually working on their first ever software project at that time, which was to essentially try to connect the different siloed databases of police forces and RCMP that exist in Canada. So there's this problem. It might be the same in the United States as well. And this is, a while ago, but essentially, if you got a speeding ticket in one city and then, 2 hours later, you got a speeding ticket in another city, and then again, 2 hours later, those police officers would not actually necessarily know that you were just getting speeding ticket after speeding ticket after speeding ticket in these different places. And it takes a while for things to kind of bubble up, and it also has to be at a certain level. So we were working on this project to sort of be able to do a federated search across all these different siloed databases and bring that all together. And this was, before things like Elasticsearch and all these different technologies existed. So it was quite a hard problem to solve. I was working on my master's degree at the time and doing this part-time. So I don't know actually what the state of that project ever became of. But then from there, I was the CTO and co-founder of a tech company, and there, of course, just as a byproduct of that, you have to be knowledgeable about security. We were in the HR tech space, so we had a lot of data about job applicants, resumes, plus employer information, including payment methods. So that was kind of my first foray into things like PCI compliance and so forth. And just as part of my responsibilities, I needed to make sure that we were keeping things locked down and that I was staying up to date in terms of the software we were running and so forth. But really, I didn't fully lean into this area until I joined Skyflow about 2 years ago. Okay. And while we don't describe ourselves as a cybersecurity product, we are a data privacy platform. You can't really have privacy without security. Yes. That's a big part of it. So I've become more and more interested in security to the point that I host a security and privacy focused podcast, partially redacted, like you mentioned in the introduction. And there's also so many amazing experts at Skyflow to learn from who have spent 20 plus years in the space that you'd have to actively be trying not to learn this stuff to not actually just like pick it up through osmosis and having conversations.
Blinders the whole time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. We have a pretty big tent in what we describe as security around here, whether it's security awareness for employees or security engineering or things like risk or privacy or compliance, and those are all pieces of the puzzle. You don't have to necessarily be working in a SOC or designing the architecture to be a part of security. So you mentioned that your career touched on security only a few places. Your working career background is primarily focused around different aspects of software development. But within that, there's a lot of variance of aspects of your work. So like you said, for 4 years, you worked with a team on Google's business communications suite. With Pragati's synergetic research, you worked with visualization techniques for mapping and reuse of ontological descriptions, XML schemas, and database schemas. And now with Skyflow, your work is closely aligned with a truly of-the-moment concept, which is data privacy, and Skyflow's data privacy vault as a service. So I would love it if you could tell me about your work journey along some of these different points, because software development and engineering ties them all together. But can you walk us through like one career role to the next and see what appealed to each one of you and what changed and what new opportunities caused you to try the next thing?
Absolutely. Just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I've had, I guess like you could describe like a diverse set of roles, jobs, projects over the years, but there's definitely some connective tissue between it all, or at least from what I see from my perspective. Like I did 3 degrees in computer science as well as a postdoc in bioinformatics.
Mm-hmm.
And along that journey to what I thought my career was going to be, which was to become a professor, I always kept a foot in industry as a software engineer, which is, when I worked for Bulletproof Solutions and a bunch of these other different companies. And my motivation for that was, one, the money helped fund my education. It was much more fun to work as a software engineer than grading papers as a teaching assistant, and you got paid a lot more. And then I also enjoyed it, but I also didn't want to lose my technical skills. I saw a lot of people who are professional researchers, whether a professor or even someone doing their PhD, that they couldn't code like a hello world application because they'd just been too far from the technology for a long time. And I was a little bit nervous about that idea, because even though I wanted to be a professor, I also still loved the industry, still loved building stuff. And I also had always thought of myself as potentially being an entrepreneur. So I wanted to keep those doors open to me. Right. And my job at Pragati actually came from my PhD work. So I was working on large scale data integration problems, exploring ways that we could use automation or AI along with like human in the loop experts, specifically in the medical research space.
Oh, okay.
And I gave a talk at a conference showcasing some of the work that I was doing. And the founder of Pragati actually happened to be there in the audience, came up to me afterwards and basically offered me like an internship on the spot, because they were working on something very similar at a NASA Ames Research Center in Mountain View, California. And they were essentially in the side of the world of like investigative search, essentially working with 3-letter acronym government agencies. Right. And they were doing similar things, like where you have this like really complicated set of data. You don't really know how everything sort of comes together. It's coming from lots of different sources. Like, how do you bring those things together in a way that you could start as an analyst or domain expert to explore it visually and comprehensively, and kind of dig in and ask different questions? And that was what we were working on there. And I remember, because I'm a Canadian citizen, I've been living in the United States now for 14 years, but at that time I was actually living in Canada. So I couldn't even go to any of our like customers' sites because of, I wasn't a US citizen and stuff like that. So I'd have to like get on a phone call and talk about like, how do you actually install this thing and use it and so forth.
Yeah. Talking through.
Yeah. And then I left academics eventually to start my own company. And I did that for about 7 years. And then I joined Google, and I eventually became their head of developer experience for business communication, APIs. And there I was kind of working on the intersection of like conversational AI and commerce. And this was all sort of pre-LLM era hype. But we wanted to be able to use channels like Rich Communication Services, which is a carrier communication service that's kind of like an upgrade to SMS, or even from places like Google Search to bring people into a conversational experience, sometimes powered by AI, also sometimes human in the loop. So a lot of the projects I've worked on have tried to combine sort of AI automation on really, really complicated issues related to data that require expertise or human in the loop as well, because they're such complicated problems, you can't necessarily fully automate them. And that's been a lot of the sort of consistency between the various jobs I've had. And then 2 years ago, I joined Skyflow, originally as their head of developer relations. And then I also expanded my scope to product marketing. And now I lead all of marketing for the company. And in many ways, I've done pretty much every job that you can have in the tech company, engineering, product management, product marketing. I've been, taught at university, been a researcher, built teams, been in IC, but all of it has sort of been in this data space across different verticals and different types of applications, but has really been centered around the data. And I think that's one of the consistent themes we see amongst the executive team at Skyflow is we're all kind of data people. We came from Salesforce or Microsoft or places dealing with really big data problems. And that's been our approach to trying to solve the problems around data privacy is how do you kind of approach this as a first principles data problem, not necessarily as something that you're kind of bolt on to an existing product or architecture.
Yeah, I was going to say the things that popped out in hearing you talk about that is that you have these, it seems like you're always sort of drawn to projects that involve big data sets and very sort of large but precise problems that need to be solved around that and stuff like that. And that seems to drive you from project to project in terms of you find this one big thing, you solve it, and it's okay, now where do we go next kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've tried to optimize my career around educational opportunities. What am I going to learn here? How's this set me up for the next thing, right. As well as I like solving problems, going back to the days when I was in my undergrad doing competitive programming, it was all about problem solving. How do you take these stories that they tell in these problem descriptions and figure out what is the algorithmic approach to solving this problem and how fast can I write that code to basically solve it? And I just really, really enjoy that. And a big motivation for my career has really been kind of what's the biggest, gnarliest problem that I can kind of jump into and have an impact on.
That definitely popped out as you went from job to job there. It's really cool. So Sean, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we'll be discussing data privacy and some of the big changes that might be happening in 2024. But first, could you tell me about the current issues around data privacy that help bring Skyflow's Data Privacy Vault as a service into creation? What are the top 2 or 3 biggest issues around data privacy that you see right now? And to that end, how does something like Skyflow's Data Privacy Vault as a service, API, and products like this work to secure some of those issues? Yeah,
so I think there's 2 big problems that we see. And they're big historical problems. Okay. One is that historically, it's been very, very hard to essentially keep data secure, but still usable. So there's always this trade-off, right? Where we can apply techniques like encryption, even techniques like tokenization and so forth, and they work for certain use cases, but they break a lot of things that we actually knew with the data. So if we encrypt the data, then it breaks things like search or analytics and so forth. So then we need to decrypt the data to actually make it usable, and then essentially we're exposing it to risk. So that's been a really hard problem to figure out, is how do you essentially keep data protected while actually keeping it usable for various workflows. And then the other big problem that I see, which is essentially what I call a PII sprawl problem or sensitive data sprawl problem. So what ends up happening, especially in a modern system, it doesn't even need to be that big. What we end up doing is we end up with a bunch of copies of the data. So if we think about collection of someone's information during an account signup form, it's not like that data just goes from the account signup form, arrives in the database, it's only ever going to live in the database. It actually touches all these different systems along the way, being passed through the API gateway. Eventually, it's going to end up in the database. We're probably going to end up with a copy in a warehouse or analytics store of some sort. Along the way, we might log it in various log files, the backups of all these different systems. So instead of having one copy of that data, we might actually have hundreds or thousands of copies of the data. Right. It's a little bit like if you took, your passport And instead of having a copy of it that you have in a secure location in your home, you created like 10,000 copies of it and put them all over the place. And then you tried to like protect those places. That's a much harder problem to solve. But that's basically the problem that we've created for ourselves in most modern systems, especially in the world of cloud, where we can just kind of like pick our pieces and plug them together and stuff like that. So we end up having to do there historically is we try to, we either build like a security fence around that. And then everybody that's within the fence, we just trust that, hopefully they should be there and they're doing the right things.
And that's insiders, right.
Yeah, and that's not a very effective means to actually lock down these systems. You're going to end up accidentally exposing someone, or even have a bad actor or someone penetrates the fence and then they have access to everything. Or you end up trying to kind of plug holes in this like leaking dam in these different places. So you end up with like one tool that provides security and governance and a bunch of other things to like your database, but then you need another tool over here and another tool over here. And then that then becomes like a huge like operational nightmare. So those have been the two fundamental problems that I see organizations really struggle with. And the way that we've approached that at Skyflow, and this comes from, like I mentioned, a lot of our background in data, like our CEO and co-founder came from Salesforce, came from Oracle, and he saw companies struggle with this over and over again. He thought about it for a long time. And what he was able to sort of, like one of the key innovations that we came up with was figuring out a way to allow us to essentially keep data secure while still usable. And we created a technology that we call polymorphic data encryption, which has essentially similar characteristics that you would want from something like homomorphic encryption, which is homomorphic encryption is like the holy grail of encryption, where you can keep everything encrypted, do whatever operations you want on it, but it's just not performant. And with basically polymorphic data encryption, we've been able to give you the same value that you get from homomorphic, where we can keep everything encrypted, but still allow you to do operations and use the data. But by restricting the problem space to essentially the PII, it becomes a solvable problem. And that is a big part of our secret sauce. So we can essentially solve this false dichotomy of essentially usability and privacy. And then the other thing is around the sprawl problem. How do you solve that? Well, that's really where the heart of this idea of isolation, protection, and governance, which a data privacy vault gives you. There's other companies that have essentially created or innovated similar technology. Companies like Google, Netflix, Apple were some of the pioneers of this. And essentially what they recognize, the same way that people have recognized that encryption keys, secrets, identity don't belong like in our database or source code because these are kind of special. We need specialized technology for them. The spirit of the data privacy vault is also recognizing that PII is also a special type of data. The rules of engagement for it are different in terms of who needs access, what they need access for it, how they perform operations on it, how often they need to touch it. So we need specialized technology developed for essentially the isolation, protection, and governance of that data, while essentially de-scoping other systems from touching it. So instead of storing this information within your database or in your data warehouse, what we're doing is we're essentially transforming the sensitive data into a non-sensitive version of that data that then you can still, because of polymorphic data encryption, it's not going to break your workflows and types of things that you need with data. Mm-hmm. So essentially what we're trying to give you is all the things that you want to do with sensitive customer data without you actually being exposed to seeing the underlying data. And that's really been the key thing.
Interesting. Okay. It's almost like a teleporter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's interesting. And I might be getting this all wrong, but I want to, it seems like a lot of the problems that you've discussed here just are kind of baked into like the last 20 years of the way like the internet has dealt with data and commerce and so forth. Like, we're going to talk about the sort of like the Wild West early parts of it, but it seems like so much of what we know about this now was kind of learned on the fly as we were trying to find more and more things to do with data. Because I don't think in like the 90s or the early 2000s people even knew like, oh, well, let's take all this data and crunch it and use it on marketing things and use it on this and spin it around here. And so once you start doing that, then you're like, oh, well, we have to protect all these little fiefdoms, like you said here. So which is, of course, why it's going to be very hard to sort of undo it. But when we spoke before the show, you described 2024 as the year where we might see the beginning of the end of what you described as, quote, the end of the Wild West era of U.S. data privacy in the U.S. and other countries that are not currently protected, and how they might begin to make moves toward passing sweeping GDPR or CCPA-style data privacy laws. But before we talk about what that might look like or speculate on it all, can you give us the current state of data privacy as it stands? You were talking about that a little bit, but like, what's the sort of like the 10,000-foot view of the way data privacy is done right now, and a quick sketch, especially of like the early kind of Wild West era when it was at its kind of wooliest versus like how we're trying to rein it in now, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a few things going on. I think things are trending in a very positive direction overall. Yep. If you look back, 15, 20 years ago. But I think, some of the problems that we were just talking about, like the PII sprawl problem, is I think one of the reasons that we've kind of gotten ourselves into that place is because partly it's like a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of data, where we've essentially taken customer data and we've treated it like all other data. And that really goes back to like 1980s thinking of when we were first designing systems to be used in the workplace, where we're collecting customer data, employee data. And back then, your data was siloed within a box underneath your computer. So it's not that someone couldn't steal it, but they had to like physically get entry to your office and like walk out with a hard drive, which was big and heavy.
And not skip leg day because they'd have to lift a 100-pound thing. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. And then, but what we've done is we've kind of taken what worked from a data and security perspective back then, and then scaled it to the cloud to millions and millions of users. And essentially we've like engineered our way into like an almost intractable problem where we have this like major sprawl issue where the data is like all over the place. But on the positive side, I think if you look at, where we were 15 years ago when social media and so forth was first kind of burst on the scene, there was at the time this like sentiment that like privacy is dead. I remember people talking about that when I was in graduate school, and they're like, who cares? We'll share everything online. And what ended up happening was, well, one, companies like Meta eventually got in a lot of trouble, but also the consumer woke up to somewhat the reality of the situation, which is that if you can use something for free, but they're collecting lots of information about you, you are essentially the product. They are monetizing you based on your data. And you should have some say about what they're doing with that. And on top of that, people learn that the information they're giving is not all that well protected, because it's always basically every week in the news, there's some major data breach that's happening. So I think consumers have become more and more aware of this problem. And since 2018, when GDPR was first introduced, there's now over 100 privacy regulations in the world. And so things are changing. And I don't think building or like essentially just thinking about data privacy purely from a regulatory standpoint is the best way to think about it. I think this should be like basically privacy is a fundamental human right. You should be developing systems that are private and secure just because it's the right thing to do, not just because some regulation tells you to do it. But at the same time, that being said, regulations do help become a forcing function for companies to do the right thing when they're not necessarily. It's not that they necessarily have an intention of like they're twiddling their thumbs and they're like, I hope there's a data breach this week. Like they don't want those things to happen, but it's easy to sort of push it down the stack of priorities when there isn't necessarily the risk of fines or other types of infractions that could happen. So privacy is now, I think, more so than ever before, a C-level boardroom conversation that's actually happening at many, many companies.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Your intrinsic optimism about companies believing that it's the right thing to do to ensure privacy, but the regulations also for those who say we could cut this amount of budget line out of our and maximize our profit. So in those cases, sometimes you do have to crack the whip a little bit, but ideally all of them want have our best interests in mind as well. So fingers crossed. But so if these changes in data privacy are indeed coming, Sean, like you said, it's likely because of external factors influencing it. People sort of realizing they're being, they are the product, as you say. No system voluntarily adds friction or complexity into the mechanics unless it's really necessary. So, I guess you've sort of already answered this, but like, along with sort of people waking up, what are some of the external factors that you think because it's definitely changed a lot in the last 2-3 years. Like it feels like it's hit kind of a breaking point here. What do you think were some of the external factors that got people to start thinking about this like really seriously?
Well, I think one is like excuse me.
Mhm.
I think one is the some of the big fines that have been issued to some big tech companies. They do make big headlines when you see a company like being fined billions of dollars and so forth.
Mhm.
That also, of course, creates more consumer awareness, and there's more and more news coverage of the issues. So I think there is two sort of forms of pressure that are happening. One is like consumer expectation, and the other is all the regulations that are coming into place. But I think another thing that we haven't really talked about is that some companies are also doing a really good job of using privacy as a differentiator. So like Apple is a really, really good example of this, where they have been really effective at using privacy as a marketing tactic, essentially.
Right.
And they're able to turn their focus on privacy as a differentiator and probably a way to actually drive revenue. So
Right.
I think
which is essentially kind of offsetting the extra costs of investing that heavily into privacy, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Mhm.
So I think they've been really smart about that approach. And I think there's more and more companies that are kind of going in that direction. And, we talked to a lot of startups at Skyflow, and we're seeing more and more startups, want their sort of culture and marketing to be, privacy first, and make that sort of like a core part of their, their identity as a company.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great answer. And I think also, I'm sure a lot of other companies are already looking at that model, but I guess it's worth sort of putting out there that like this is something that you can both, do as a revenue generator, as you say, as well as doing the right thing. As you said, we should all want to, do right by our customers. So
yeah, and I think that if you even compare it to something like the car industry, where there are certain regulations that exist that cars have to, meet from a safety perspective. And there's also cars that use safety as a marketing tactic and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they've been able to figure out at least I'm not in the car industry, so maybe I'm wrong on this, but my take at least is that I don't see a lot of news and buzz about how this has become a barrier to innovation. Like the fact that we need to have seatbelts in the car is limiting our ability to innovate in the car space. I think the opposite actually happens, that it actually creates innovation. So, there was a time where you could, drive and talk on your cell phone at the same time when cell phones first came into play. And essentially, we eventually realized that was dangerous, and we developed or innovated new technologies to still allow us to use a phone in a car, but do it in a more safe way. So right. I think that it can actually be an inflection point or ingestion for innovation and technology improvements that lead to not only more safe products, but actually probably more revenue for a company.
That leads perfectly into my next question here, because I wanted to talk about the user experience around all this stuff. So, to split the experience of data privacy into the insider view, that we are learning about here, data privacy, GDPR, and all that, and to the average user view, will this more closely watched era of data privacy look like from a UX perspective? Because and I know this is not your area, but at this point, every website you go on, you're customizing your cookies. I accept, I don't accept, I customize. And I think there's a user experience element of it that is, people don't know why they're doing it. They don't know why it has to happen every single time. It's exhausting to them. And it gets them a little frustrated. So, I mean, do you think that this type of customize your experience before you start using the site or service will continue and get more intrusive as these regulations progress? Is there a possibility of some kind of universal key that we could, like a keychain that we could tell each site, okay, use only these or no cookies, I'm not hungry or whatever, and apologies for the glare because I'm about to don my small tinfoil hat here, but it almost seems like some of this is almost done as a way to sort of exhaust people around the idea of data safety and just have everyone just say, okay, I don't care anymore, take my data, whatever. Does something like your APIs, and other sort of regulations that are coming up, do you think that will streamline the user experience? Do you see a path forward that way? Or is this just going to be sort of part of the new in an attempt to make sure that everyone's being sort of ethical in the way that they track and so forth?
Mm-hmm. I certainly hope that this is things don't get worse from a cookie pop-up standpoint.
Right.
And to be honest, like I don't know what the solution here is necessarily, but I don't think what is there today is sustainable.
Yeah.
It's just something that feels like it has to change. Like it's hard to imagine the web 5 years from now and that this is still the situation. It's kind of like in the old days when you used to have to, in the like browser wars era, where you would come in and be like, choose your experience. Are you on Internet Explorer? Or are you on, Firefox or Netscape or something like that? And then you would have like a different experience depending on which browser you're going to. I just like, it's just not sustainable. I think systems that have a lot of like friction and frustration that are actually not effective are not ones that kind of win out in the long run. And also, a lot of these pop-ups are designed to be confusing to people so that they do the thing that the company wants them to do. And I also think that is, not in the best interest of the consumer of the browser. So I just don't think that these things are going to be there for the long run. And but I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Like I could certainly there should be a potentially something where there's like some level of trust that can be involved, right? Like essentially you're giving informed consent to the company or to the website that they can track you. And you should be able to maybe blanket give informed consent to like a block of types of companies that you're trust or meet some certain standard or something like that, versus just like every single time having to agree to do it. And I think it's a lot of ways it's like kind of lazy, user experience when you always have to prompt the user. Like ideally, a great software system knows what the sort of default someone actually wants ahead of time, and I think that potentially that's something that we can move towards in the future. But I don't know exactly, and I also don't know all the limitations around the regulations that are preventing someone from doing something better.
Makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Just thought I wanted to bounce it off the wall. It blows my mind that I have to literally, enable cookies every single time I go to the same website. Even, it's like, it's just wild. So I want to turn this into the, the career space. I want to get you some new, junior professionals possibly, in your field here. So people currently working in data privacy or trying to get into it, what will the changes coming in the next few years mean for their skill sets? Do you think that there are any new skills or learning areas that you recommend that people who already do work in this space need to get into so they don't get left behind?
I think the big, obvious one is AI. So, privacy is one of the biggest question marks and biggest concerns surrounding LLMs and other forms of generative AI right now. And it's what's stopping a lot of larger investment in them from companies. Like lots of companies are interested in learning, but we're not seeing a ton of moving beyond sort of demoware, proof of concept or interest because of some of the challenges around privacy and security. And there's also a lot of, I think, misleading information out there and people creating products, privacy or governance for AI that don't really solve the fundamental issues. So I think this is something that privacy professionals, whether you're entering that space today or you're already operating in that space, then you need to kind of get up to speed with, because a big part of your job, if you're a privacy engineer, a lot of times is bridging the gap between the engineering organization and maybe legal and compliance. So you need to be able to speak to the engineer in the language that they understand and the way they like to talk about things, and then be able to translate that essentially to legal and compliance in a way that they can understand it, so that essentially everyone can do their job in a way that's going to work for everybody. And if AI is an investment or LLMs are as an investment that your company is making, then you need to be able to speak that kind of language and have enough knowledge about it. What are the actual problems that exist there, and how does the technology work? Why is this different than some of the problems that we've seen in the past with a database and so forth?
Yeah. So many security roles and roles in privacy and related things seem to involve being intermediaries between different parts of the company and being able to understand both sides of the wall and being able to sort of explain over it to make sure everyone's sort of on board, which I don't think was necessarily the case 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So for listeners who are choosing or maybe re-choosing their careers after another role and are considering areas like data collection, data privacy, privacy regulation, data security, and others, what are some must-have sort of skills? I mean, you sort of learned along the way and so forth. Like, what would you recommend now that someone getting into this space would do in terms of experiences, in terms of certs, and in terms of learning? Either at home or in a professional standpoint, like what are the things that are absolute must-haves for people working in this area?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on the role that you want to move into. Like, so let's say that you're, I don't know, a salesperson or you're product marketing or something like that, and you're like, oh, I'm interested in like security, or I'm interested in privacy. I want to take my role but do it in that space. Then that's different than I'm an engineer and I want to pivot into being like a privacy engineer. So in terms of if you're in an existing role and you kind of want to move into the area of security and privacy, I think a big part of it there is there's like educating yourself at least broadly about like the tools and technologies in the space. What are the problems? What are the challenges that different companies face? How would people solve this today? What does future look like, and so forth? And there's tons and tons of resources available to do those kinds of things today, like podcasts and YouTube and conferences and lots of articles and so forth. So a lot of it's kind of just like trying to get up to speed so that you have some sense of, what's actually happening. How do I like talk about, potentially the product or space that I'm interested in an authentic way? And that is important regardless of the role that you're in. If you're in engineering and you kind of want to move into privacy engineering, I think that's great because it is a very like fast growing space. And they're always looking for people who have technical backgrounds that can kind of move into privacy engineering. And I think that's something that's changing. If you looked even probably 5 years ago on LinkedIn and did a search for privacy engineering jobs, probably the first like 50 pages is like Google, Meta, and like Microsoft or something like that. And now there's a lot more diversity in terms of the companies that are hiring for that role. And we already talked about sort of a lot of your job is sort of being that translator or storyteller between two areas. And I also think that, this is an exciting time to get into the space because of a lot of the things that we're talking about. Like there is a growing momentum to make this, a priority, day one priority for companies. And there's also a lot of really exciting things that are happening in the world of privacy enhancing technologies, like things like secure enclaves and homomorphic encryption and secure multi-party computation. So there's a lot of different things that you can do in the space. It doesn't necessarily just have to be like hardcore technical. There's lots of opportunities for people who can kind of bridge the gap between the super technical and the not so technical.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. So as we wrap up today, Sean, I'm trying something new here for 2024. So bear with me. Could you tell our listeners the best piece of career advice you ever received? And is that advice still something you would give to professionals preparing to enter the field now?
Sure. So I've had a lot of probably both good and bad career advice over the years. So
sure.
Hard to pick. But one thing that always kind of jumps to mind for me was it was kind of like an accidental advice from my master's thesis supervisor, who's kind of this like crazy Russian expat to Canada that never really adopted the Canadian lifestyle, but he joined basically in communist era USSR. So Russia changed a lot since he'd lived there. Canada changed a lot, and he was kind of like a fragment of the old world. But one of the things that he said to me once was that the problem with people with PhDs is that they think they know something. And essentially what I think he was saying there, or at least what I interpreted that to be, is that they reach sort of a level of, credibility or achieving something like a PhD, and they stop learning because they think that they're an expert and they stop being curious.
They're at the top of the mountain. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you always have to keep learning. And I think that's easier than ever to do that. As I mentioned, there's podcasts, YouTube, conferences, all this sort of stuff. And that's really where I've tried to optimize my career, is really around how am I going to grow and learn. And because I've been able to sort of skill stack across these different types of roles, it's given me a lot of flexibility in terms of like where I take my career. And then it really becomes like an alignment of, do I really believe in the problem that this company is solving and cares about? And do I like the company and so forth? And I'll figure out a role that's going to be a good fit for me there.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you very much. So speaking of, you mentioned, certain ties to the outside world, including podcasts. I would like to have you tell our listeners about your multiple podcasts, Software Engineering Daily and Partially Redacted. What are the focus of these shows? What kind of guests do you get? And if you can think of one, what's an ideal episode to introduce new listeners to either of these shows?
Sure. So I host actually 3 podcasts, but we'll focus on Software Huddle and Partially Redacted. So Partially Redacted is focused on privacy and security, engineering related topics. And I'd say the types of guests that we have there span everything from, regular engineers that want to talk about something, a problem that they had to solve that relates to security and privacy, to privacy professionals kind of sharing their thoughts and experiences with building privacy organizations or working with engineering teams, or how do you build a privacy program from scratch, to security professionals as well, talking about some of the challenges that they face. And, we've had people from, Snowflake to Google, Microsoft, to lots of companies like that, all the way to Dr. Lori Craner, who runs the CMU privacy engineering program. So, professors all the way to, people that are working in big tech. And then on the Software Huddle side, that podcast is primarily focused on software engineering, sort of tech news, tech investment. Guests are primarily engineers, product people, sometimes venture capitalists and founders. And I think like a great episode there for people to check out is this interview I did with Bob Muglia back in December, who is the former CEO of Snowflake. He was at executive at Microsoft for 23 years. He's essentially seen the entire life of structured data, essentially like SQL-based databases. Like he was the person who ran the SQL Server group at Microsoft, to essentially building Snowflake, the modern data platform. And he wrote a great book that we talked about. But he's a really smart guy that has a huge breadth of stories and experience working directly with like Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And it's just like one of the funnest, most interesting interviews I've ever done.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I'm going to check that out right after this. Thank you. Okay, well, I hope everyone will check out Software Huddle, is it? And
yes.
Partially Redacted. So one final question. If our listeners want to learn more about Sean Falconer and Skyflow, where should they look online?
Skyflow is pretty easy. You can find us at skyflow.com or, search and we'll come up. And then for me, I'm pretty easy to find as well. There's a lot of stuff on the internet that I produced over the years, but if you just look me up on Twitter or LinkedIn with my name, Sean Falconer, you'll find me. And I'm always happy to connect with people and be helpful if I can.
Nice. Yeah, you almost certainly get some connects. We have a very engaged listenership here, so look forward to that. And if you all decide you want to connect with Sean, let him know that you heard about him on Cyberwork. So thanks so much for your time and insights today, Sean. This was a real pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
And thank you to our 80,000 plus Cyberwork viewers and subscribers. Your input and enthusiasm make this a joy to do each week. If you have any topics you'd like us to cover or guests you'd like to have on the show, please feel free to drop them in the comments below. I always like to hear what y'all are interested in as well. So before I let you go, I hope you'll remember to visit infosecinstitute.com/free to get a whole bunch of free and exclusive stuff for Cyberwork listeners. For instance, our new security awareness training series, Work Bites, which is just awesome, and I encourage you to go and watch the trailer. Do you have better security awareness skills than your coworkers? What if those coworkers were a pirate, a vampire, an alien, a zombie, and a fairy princess? Infosecinstitute.com/free is also the place to go for your free cybersecurity talent development ebook, where you'll find our in-depth training plans for the 12 most common security roles, including SOC analyst, penetration tester, cloud security engineer, information risk analyst, privacy manager, secure coder, and more. Once again, that's infosecinstitute.com/free. And yes, the link is in the description below. Thank you once again to Sean Falconer and Skyflow. And thank you all so much for watching and listening. And until next week, happy learning.